So it's a great pleasure to introduce Sainath. Sainath is an award-winning reporter, formerly of The Hindu, who's won many global and national awards for his reporting. He's the winner of the Ramon Magsaysay Award in 2007 for journalism, literature, and creative communication arts. He was the first reporter to win Amnesty International's Global Human Rights Journalism Prize in 2000. He was also the first Indian reporter to win the European Commission's Lorenzo Natali Prize for Human Rights Journalism in 1995. Apart from the 40-plus print media awards and 2 documentary films, Nero's Guess, and A Tribe of His Own, he's also received up to 20 awards each. Sainath is the author of Everybody Loves a Good Drought, published in 1996. It's now in its 48th printing, and it's been translated into multiple languages. In just the past few years, he's published well over 150 investigative reports on India's agrarian crisis in the Hindu newspaper alone, the largest journalistic body of work ever on India's farming communities. Many of those stories from households of marginal farmers and landless laborers across the country. He takes his own photographs as well for all his reports. Since November 2001, an exhibition of Sainath's photographs has also toured India. His latest project is an online archive called The People's Archive of Rural India. It aims at capturing everyday lives of everyday people, their labor, languages, livelihoods, arts, crafts, and many other aspects of rural India. Sainath has taught journalism at Princeton, at UC Berkeley, at Sophia Polytechnic in Mumbai, and the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Sainath, who will be speaking today on a talk entitled Slumdogs versus Millionaires, Inequality and Agrarian Distress in India. Right,
thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. The photographs you were seeing on the screen, and you can see them again if you like, later down, are pictures of the families, of some of the families, of the nearly 300,000 Indian farmers who have committed suicide in the last 19 years. All those pictures, in fact, each of those are the families of one victim or the other. I will get into, each and every photograph has a story behind it. I will get into this one. Since 1995, in official numbers, about 300,000 farmers have committed suicide. And if you break that up decade-wise, the rate for the last 10, 12 years has been about one farmer's suicide every 32 minutes. It's a very high rate, even in a country with a high rate of suicides. Farmers in India commit suicide at a rate 45% higher than that of any other part of the population, of the rest of the population, minus farmers. How that has come about and why it's so and why it continues is something we'll try getting into. But first, I just want to say your title says Slumdogs versus Millionaires, which is correct, and also speaks of inequality and agrarian distress. I want to say that the farmers' suicides, horrendous though they are not the agrarian crisis. They are not the agrarian distress. They are a manifestation of it. They are not the cause of the agrarian crisis that I'll be talking about, but its consequence. They are not its origin, but its outcome. There's 300,000 of them, but they are still just a manifestation of a much larger crisis. Let's begin with the inequality stuff, and then I'll come to one of these stories. This has been a big week for anniversaries. It's astonishing how 3 things run parallel. 1, life on the ground. 2, the UN bureaucracy assigns Almost now, I think every day of every week in every year has been taken for something or the other. You know, October 15th, by the way, was the International Day for Rural Women. Did you see a single thing in the media at all about it? There was one on Yahoo, I wrote it. It's the International Day for Rural Women. The situation of rural women post-2008 has dramatically deteriorated in most countries of the world. Okay. We can talk about that if you like at some point. October 17th was the UN International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and you know how well we've done that since September 2008. And 2014 is the International Year of the Family Farm, and nowhere are they dying faster than in the United States, which loses family farms at the rate of 30,000 a year between 1987 and 1992, and subsequently at a lower rate because there are much fewer farms left. In fact, the International Year of the Family Farm should have been a very important event on the agenda of students, researchers, journalists, everyone, because small farms across the world they are the largest employer in the world. About 40% of the world's employment comes from small farms. Okay. 2, outside of the United States, the world as a whole gets 70% of its food from small farms, not from corporate farms. Incidentally, in the United States, if you want to look at how the family farm is doing, most people who still call themselves farmers, that's less than 2% of the population, earn their money off the farm, not on it. If we confined American family farm only to farm income, if we calculate only farm income, 80% of American family farms are below the poverty line. But they survive because they make money off the farm. A farmer in Iowa takes a job in the city because that's where he's going to get health care. So he holds that job and does the farm, because only less than 20% of income comes from the farm. Maybe in some exceptional cases, 30% or so. So that's the situation of the family farm. In the Indian media, only one anniversary mattered. October 20th, Forbes Asia declared that the 100 richest Indians were now all dollar billionaires. Every single one of them. All the 100 richest Indians are now dollar billionaires. By the way, that's an increase of 1/3 in their wealth and 40% in their numbers in 8 months. In the March issue of Forbes, my favorite website, in the March issue of Forbes, there were 56 of them. On the October 20th cover, there's 100 of them. 3 of the world's richest men, sorry girls, they are men. 3 of the world's richest 10 guys are Indians. And once they've now that they've come to this 100 figure, it makes us either the 4th we were already the 5th. We now are the country with the ranked number 4 in dollar billionaires across the world. Applause, applause. We were 5th, but now we have shown those Germans their place. Our dads are richer than their dads. And there are a couple of pretenders between us and the United States. Some of you may know of them as China and Russia. The Chinese have a fair number of billionaires, but their net asset worth, if you take the per capita worth of each of these billionaires, it's just a piffling 1 billion apiece. Our guys are worth 3.5 billion apiece. And the net worth of our billionaires is 346 billion, according to Forbes. I trust them on these subjects, which is about 12%, 10 to 12% of gross domestic product. In a country of 1.25 billion people, 100 individuals have wealth equivalent to 12% of the GDP. So anyway, the Chinese, as you can see, are not really in the race. As for the Russians, there's our obvious moral superiority. Every 5 years, the Russians send all their billionaires to prison. we send ours to Parliament. Mature democracy, right? Right. So, yeah. So that's where we are. The same country that ranks fourth in dollar billionaires in the world ranks 135th in the United Nations Human Development Index. India ranks below every single Latin American country, including Bolivia, in the UN Human Development Index. We rank below every Caribbean country barring Haiti. Barring Haiti. And several African countries do better than us. The country that ranks fourth in the dollar billionaires ranks 57th in the Global Hunger Index, which only covers about 81 nations. And over 10 years, for 10 years, I don't know about this year, I haven't checked that, but for 10 years, ahead of us in the Global Hunger Index, performing better on the issue of hunger, is Rwanda, which has had civil war and a genocide. Botswana is way ahead of us. All our South Asian neighbors do better than us on the hunger index. Sri Lanka is way ahead. Even on the United Nations Human Development Index, Sri Lanka is about 20 positions higher. And Sri Lanka had a civil war for 30 years. But none of them has $100 billionaires, right? They can't beat us at that. Oh yeah, there are lists where we are not number 4 or 5 or 135. There are lists where we are number 1. Costliest weddings in the world. And that too is a Forbes list. I would say that the first 3 ranks in the 10 are Indian. At the very top is the Indian tycoon who is also in the 10 richest. His name is Mr. Lakshmi Mittal. Now, Mr. Mittal's claim to fame, you can't blame him, I guess. It was the wedding season in India and he couldn't get a wedding hall appropriate to his sense of grandeur. So for his daughter's wedding, he rented the Palace of Versailles. Yeah. And flew down a Bollywood film crew so that all of you could get what you're all waiting for, Mittal the movie. Right? And now the big spending in weddings in India is on, have any of you ever been to a theme wedding? Yeah? Okay. A theme wedding is something like this. Suppose we take the old Mughal court. The hosts of the wedding recreate an entire 3-acre, 4-acre edifice of what the Mughal court, the court of the Mughals looked like. And the hosts of the wedding, if you're all guests, they tog you up. Months before they take measurements, it's an industry in itself. They make Mughal-style clothes for you or what they imagine the Mughals wore. Right? The entire thing is a Mughal theme. Now this varies according to city and state and taste and refinement. If you're in Kolkata and of highly refined culture, you can go and see a themed wedding which replicates the Sistine Chapel, which costs about 30 million rupees to build and will be dismantled after 12 hours. Okay. So you have at this end of the spectrum astonishing wealth of a kind. Oh yeah, let me say this. Maybe the US is number 1 in the Forbes list, but the average Indian millionaire, because labor is so cheap, is richer than the average North American millionaire. North American millionaire, a multimillionaire in North America, somebody who could put 3 kids through college without knowing it. The guys I know in India could own 3 colleges without knowing it. The last education minister of Maharashtra, the state where I live in Mumbai, owned 55 institutions. He couldn't remember the names of half of them. Yeah? But annually he would take out advertisements of himself with a background of his institutions. The fastest growing thing in India is not software, not hardware, not IT, but inequality. It's grown faster in the preceding 15 years than at any time, in the last 15 years, than at any time in the preceding 50 years. I'm creating this canvas because the agrarian crisis and distress that I'm speaking about have to be located in the context of that inequality, or you will not understand it. It's not that something has gone wrong with the soil or farming, or that somebody has forgotten how to do farming. It isn't that. You have to see it against the context of that great inequality. Remember that the country that ranks 135th in the United Nations Human Development Index boasted 9% growth for a decade without creating a single job of consequence. Jobless growth. Okay? It also has something to do. It also leads to interesting discussions, which we may or may not have time to have, on what growth means and what kinds of growth are there in the world. Are we talking with growth for growth's sake, or growth with justice, or growth through justice, or growth with distribution? Edward Abbey, the American ecologist, way back in the 1980s, summed up part of the debate in one line. Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. That grows. And the faster it grows, the sooner you're dead. So what kind of growth are we talking about? India had 9% growth and 300,000 farmers' suicides and no significant creation of employment, or in very narrow sectors and islands. So you have many of those countries in the 135 above us, barring China, none of them had 9% growth over a sustained period of a decade. But they all did much better in handling hunger, in handling agrarian distress. All of them did better. So we need to ask what happened. What happened over there? When I come back to a picture, I'm going to enter with that into the farm crisis, but the inequality issue, just to give you, this country that had 9% growth for a decade, had 9% for a decade without lowering child malnourishment by even 3%, by 3 percentage points. In the period of the liberalization and privatization, in that period, there were 2 national family health surveys. There's very little downward movement of child malnourishment between the two, though they are 7-8 years apart. In fact, the last National Family Health Survey, child malnourishment in India was 46% of all children below the age of 5 were declared malnourished. To give you an idea of how huge 46% is, it's about twice the average rate of malnourishment of children below 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Ethiopia's rate was 38% when India's was 46%. Okay? So sub-Saharan Africa, which did not have 9% growth, which is not the world's 4th greatest military power, which is not the 6th nuclear power in the planet, which is not a software powerhouse or a IT superpower, managed to handle hunger better than we did. And at some point we'll discuss what hunger itself means. How do you measure this idea of hunger? But let me get in here with and start the stories of the farm. This is Kamlabai Pawar. As I said, all these hundreds of photographs, every one of them has a story. I will maybe give you 2 or 3. The huge driving canvas, every suicide has a multiplicity of factors, not one. But when you have 300,000 of them in the same occupation, you want to start looking for common factors. Every suicide has a multiplicity of factors. Immediate, what were the long-term causes, what was driving someone, what was that final spark or aggravation that took a person over the edge. But when you have 300,000 of them, you want to start looking at what are the common factors. The large canvas common factor is indebtedness. And there's a reason why people suddenly became more indebted than they were earlier. According to government data, and all the data I use is Government of India data, there are no other sources that you can look at, though you can look at some very funny studies on poverty by the private sector. The indebtedness of the Indian peasantry doubled between 1991 and 2001, according to the National Sample Survey Organization, the biggest data collection organization of India. Indebtedness went up from 26% of all peasant households to 46.8% of 48.6% of all peasant households. It means in a period of 10 years, indebtedness doubled. It was also a period when banks withdrew from the countryside, just as, by the way, they did in many advanced industrial countries, including the United States. They closed branches in the countryside. In Australia, they closed branches in rural Australia. You should know that there are significant numbers of farmers' suicides in the Midwest, in the Farm Belt. You can go and have a look at the numbers for Minnesota. Go and have a look at go and have a look at your census map on youth suicides and see where the reddest part of the map is. It's in your Farm Belt. Okay? The crisis of the small farm is worldwide, and it is the outcome of an assault on small holdings by corporate agriculture. In the United States, in the 60s, even in the 60s, about 25% of your population was in agriculture. In the 40s, definitely more, 25, 28%. Today, less than 2%. Do you know that in your American census, you do not have a separate category for farmer anymore? You go to other, you click on the drop down and choose farmer. There aren't enough to count. It's infra-dig for the census. Okay? You have this, this is one country where 75% of your output comes from, food output, comes from about 50,000 farm holding operations, most of them corporate and businesses. So the livelihoods, farming is not just, agriculture is not just about output, it's about livelihoods. It's about people having a livelihood in it, being engaged in it in various ways, not necessarily as farmers. Okay. Now, Kamla Bai's husband was the head of a clan of Banjaras or Lambadas, a semi-nomadic tribe. He was, Gosavi Pawar was the head of the clan, and he was known in the clan as Bada Pitaji, which means big father, which means that in that tribal, in the clans making up that tribal unit, he is responsible for the marriage of every girl, every single girl in that, in all the affiliated clans. Their marriage has to be conducted and presided over by him, which he had done for 30 years. As the agrarian crisis bit into the region where he used to live, in Vidarbha, he went bankrupt. Then people started pooling marriages. They started pooling marriages. On the one hand, you had the costliest wedding in the world conducted by an Indian. At around exactly the same time, tens of thousands of farm girls were not able to get married because of their families' bankruptcies. If you look at the church registers of the Christian region of Wayanad in Kerala, marriages fell by more than half because nobody had the money to get their child married. Okay? So at the time that Lakshmi Mittal was occupying the palace of Versailles, Gosavi Pawar was trying to get 3 girls married at the same time because it saved money. These family units came from different parts of the country. They're semi-nomadic people, the Banjaras. And they came from Rajasthan, Gujarat, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Maharashtra itself, which is where they are largely spread out. In fact, it's thought that about 800 years ago, they moved outwards from Punjab and Rajasthan. So you have a situation where he's got to fulfill his obligation as the big father of the tribe to get these 3 girls married. He goes to the bank. Meanwhile, agriculture has tanked, and he has got this. He's got 13 acres of cotton. The largest number of the suicides are amongst cotton farmers. 4/5 of the suicides are amongst cash crop farmers. It's very important to understand. The suicides are largely linked to growth of cash crop, expansion of cash crop. Food crop farmers commit suicide much more rarely. What is cash crop? I'm talking about those who are growing sugarcane, those who are growing cotton, those who are growing groundnut. These are not so much for your personal consumption as for sale on the market, they're cash crops. Now, food crop farmers don't commit suicide on that scale. You see, however bad the situation, however bad the volatility of prices, if your food crop market collapses, you can still eat your paddy. Cotton is a bit difficult to digest. Right. So the majority of the farm suicides are those of cash crop farmers. He's a cash crop farmer, Gosavi Pawar. He goes out for his loan. The government has declared a season of distress, given orders to the banks not to collect existing loans because the farmers are in no condition to repay, but to give them a grace period of a year. But the bank nonetheless puts the squeeze on Pawar when he goes there. Now, Mr. Pawar goes there. There's a very interesting situation in the bank. The manager is seated at one chair. Beside the manager is another gentleman who turns out to be a money lender. And he is linked to the bank manager. Okay? And Mr. Pawar himself says, "Sir, can you give me a loan of 65,000 rupees for my 13 acres? By that time, it had reached 7,000 rupees an acre, unirrigated land, cultivation. Today, the cultivation costs are something bizarrely, obscenely expensive. So then the bank manager said, "Yes, I'll give you the 65,000 if you return the 50,000 that you owe the bank," which was a violation of the government of India's declaration of distress, do not collect this season. Okay? So Pawar doesn't know where he's going to get that 50,000. The money lender chips in. He gives Pawar 50,000, who hands it over to the bank, who gives him 15,000 because minus 65,000 minus 50,000. But I don't know if any mathematician can calculate the rate of interest for 2 minutes, because on the transaction of the 65,000 in a couple of minutes, the money lender got 2,500. So what was Pawar left with finally? He was left with 12,500 for 7 acres. Oh, 12,500 was what he was left with. That would be about $200. He was left with $200 to go and cultivate 13 acres of land. Agriculture had tanked. Meanwhile, he went around from lender to lender, from merchant to merchant, trying to get one new sari for the 3 girls whose marriages he was responsible for. He couldn't. So he killed himself. I went to his village at about that time. I saw something that was moving and inspiring and incredibly tragic. Now, the girls who were his nieces, not one of them was directly his relative, they were part of the clan, but they're all his daughters in the tribe's understanding. They didn't want to go ahead with the wedding, neither did the grooms. They wanted to cancel the weddings. I saw an entire village of very poor people gather around and persuade these 3 couples to go ahead with the wedding. They told them, "Your big father killed himself because he could not get your weddings done. The best way you will honor him is to get the weddings done." And some of the poorest people you can imagine lined up with gifts of half a kilo of rice, say 1 pound of rice, half a pound of wheat, old saris, old vessels. They gifted these to the families of the girls, and some of the poorest people collectively organized and sponsored those 3 weddings that took place. In India, with the wedding, you have a wedding procession. So as the wedding procession of these three girls came out onto the highway, they ran into the funeral procession and cortege of Gosavi Pawar coming in from the other direction. The people carrying the body quickly ran away into the side, into the woods, because it's a bad omen for the wedding, for the girls to see their big Bada Pitaji dead. But the girls saw him and burst out crying. And so in the house of Gosavi Pawar, one of 300,000 farmers who committed suicide, that day I saw 3 weddings and a funeral, and it wasn't funny. Okay? That's one of hundreds of stories. That was connected to debt. The country, by the way, which boasts of being the hottest destination in medical tourism. The country that boasts of being the hottest destination in medical tourism. Our only rivals really are Thailand, right? Which has also a significant number of doctors and medical. The same country, in the last 20 years, the number of people not seeking medical treatment for purely financial reasons has doubled and is now something like 30% of the population. Meaning 300 million people are not seeking medical attention, not because it's too far off, but because they can't afford it. We're just like you guys. We have the most private controlled medical system in the world, and we are locked onto the model of the United States, by the way. We are going to get to be as bad as you. I suppose you know that healthcare is one of the, probably over 30 years, either the number 1 or the number 2 cause of bankruptcies in the United States, of individual bankruptcies. But I'm sure you know that. So you have healthcare is another thing that's pushing them over. One was cultivation. The costs of cultivation I was telling you about. When I first went to Pawar's region in 2003, it cost 2,500 to 4,000 rupees. In those days, $80 to cultivate 1 acre of unirrigated cotton. It cost 10,000 to 12,000 rupees. In those days, about $200 to $250 to cultivate 1 acre of irrigated cotton. An irrigated acre takes much more costs, obviously. You're going to put in more inputs, put in more chemicals, more fertilizer, everything. And the costs of everything are higher. Last year, 10 years later, the cost of an unirrigated acre of land to cultivate it had reached 20,000, it's about $350. And the cost of an irrigated acre to cultivate an irrigated acre of cotton had reached 45,000 rupees, which is about $800. Meaning the cost of cultivation had gone up 5-fold, but the income of the farmer had not gone up even 2-fold, which led to huge bankruptcies, indebtedness. The costs rose because of a particular process that has been on worldwide. But coming back to health, you have many of the, when I have been to about 800 to 850 households where there have been suicides, many of which I documented. In all these households, health expenditures were the largest component of family debt outside of the process of cultivation. Okay? There were extraordinary health expenditures in this. And by the way, my own finding is confirmed by the findings of the Reserve Bank of India's surveys, by the surveys of the National Sample Survey Organization. They're all clear on this. Health expenditure is the fastest growing component of rural family debt. My friend Narasimha Reddy, one of probably the finest rural reporter in the country we call India, he and I visited a guy who had tried to commit suicide. Most farmers, 4/5 of the suicides are committed by the farmer drinking pesticide. That's the farmer's weapon of choice because that's available easily in the household. So this guy had tried committing suicide and his friends had done something incredibly courageous and I mean, really wonderful. It was in an interior village. They turned a cot upside down, tied ropes to the four legs of the cot, placed him on the underside of the cot, put the ropes on their shoulders, and ran a few miles to the highway, ran to save his life. They got to a jeep, a vehicle, an SUV type of vehicle, put him in that, raced him to the nearest big hospital, some 60, 70 kilometers away, and saved his life. And when I entered the hospital, he was abusing his friends in language that would make a sailor on shore leave blush. And the language he was doing it in is Telugu, which is pretty handsomely suited to strong expression. It's a close runner-up to Punjabi, Romy. So I asked him, I said, I don't understand. These guys saved your life. They did, I mean, your family owes them everything. Why are you abusing them? He looked at me with utter contempt and said, you don't get it, do you? You don't understand a damn thing. I asked him, so I don't, so tell me. He said, I tried committing suicide because of 4 years of sustained agriculture failure, during which I ran up a debt of 100,000 rupees, which is about $1,500. It took him 4 years to run up a debt of $1,500, which he said I had no chance of repaying. He said it took me 4 years to do that. 4 days in this hospital, and I've run up a bill of $850. Why didn't they just let me die? In 4 days, he ran up half the debt, more than half the debt that he had run up in 4 years of agricultural failure. One of the big things in India is super specialty hospitals that are given huge grants in land at throwaway rates. In like say in Bandra Reclamation where I live, the Leelavati hospital got land. That land is more expensive than what you would pay in Manhattan. And they got it at throwaway rates on the story of all corporate hospitals in India, that we're going to reserve 30% of beds for poor people. None of them has fulfilled even 5% of that quota. Okay? So health was another factor. Input costs were another factor. Costs exploded. How did those costs explode? In 1991, India entered the brave new world of neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization. And there were 8 processes which have roughly taken place almost everywhere in the world. The first, I call it mechanomics. It tastes the same everywhere, those economic policies. The first of those principles is the withdrawal of the state from sectors that matter to poor people. The state did not wither away in the Marxist utopia. The state became more interventionist than ever before, but nakedly, brazenly on the side of the rich. Please look at how your state intervened to save the big banks after 2008. Too big to fail. Yeah, what about the little guys who go bust? What about all of you? What about all of us? The state is not interventionist there. Okay? So you have the state, withdrawal of the state from sectors that matter to poor people, from health, education, sanitation, from these sort of things. The second of those processes is the imposition, the cuts, massive cuts in subsidies and life supports for the poor people, for the poorest. Third, the imposition of user costs on those who can afford them least, like hospital charges on very, very poor agricultural laborers. 4, a rapid transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, resources of transfer from the poor to the rich, like the giving away of public land to corporate hospitals at a 10th of their market, 10th or 20th of their market value. That's public land and that's public property, but that's only one of 1,000 giveaways. 5th, the privatization of just about everything, including intellect and soul. About 10, 15 years ago, when people used to introduce me at talks, I used to wonder when they would introduce me as a public intellectual. And I used to wonder, what's that? Today I've sort of figured out it means that those of us who aren't privatized yet and have not become members of think tanks, and either for reasons of integrity or for not getting the right price, I don't know. But those are public intellectuals are those who haven't been privatized yet. Do you know the last thing that they were trying to privatize in Mumbai? In the railway stations, those of you who are Indian and those of you who have visited India, just have you seen little boys sitting at the corners of the railway polishing shoes and charging 5 rupees, 10 rupees for polishing shoes? The Central Railway of India privatized the shoe shine boys' spaces. Then there was a huge protest and they withdrew from it. I'm very proud to say that the story that exposed it was done by a student of mine. I mean, this is the insanity of privatizing, as I said, the privatization of just about everything. 6, there are about 8 or 10 such processes. The tremendous rise of inequality with the plunder of public resources. 7, the rise of what I call the ideology of market fundamentalism. The idea that the market has an answer to every problem in the world. 8, the suborning of local institutions of governance, like the panchayats in India, the gram sabhas, by which a government can override what a local government says and take your land forcibly, acquire your land, and hand it over to corporations at next to nothing. So these are the processes that fueled. Remember this, a farmer is someone who's not just farming. He's got children in college and school. He's got an ailing mom in hospital. He's got 2 daughters whose weddings he is to preside over in traditional Indian fashion. He's got to pay for the clothes. He's got to pay for a number of other things. So the rise of prices everywhere, and this is point 9 of that list of 10 processes. It's called market-based pricing, which simply means conferring on the corporate world the right to price gouging. Like, for instance, a packet of seed. Local seed used to cost 9 rupees a kilogram in 1991. 9 rupees a kilogram. But oh yeah, the American concentration in agriculture is so strong that we don't count, even our seed packets are accommodated accordingly. We have a peculiar figure called 450 grams. You'd think it would be 500 or 1,000. Why 450 grams? Because that's 1 pound. And the seed companies think in pounds. Okay? They are worldwide seed companies like Monsanto and others in that field. Now, by 2003, seed packets were about 350 to 400 rupees per pound. Okay? By 2007, seed packets were about 1,800 rupees, from 9 rupees to 1,800. 1,800 rupees, $30 a pound. At that time, it was $45. It was a price no American farmer had paid. No American farmer was paying. I spent quite a bit of time in those years in the farms of Minnesota and Iowa. No American farmer was paying such prices. And this is called market-based pricing. It destroyed the economies of scale of all these small producers. They were paying incredibly high prices. The price of seed had gone up 700 to 900%, but the income of the farmer had not. Okay? There was no natural calamity, no tsunami. We killed those farmers by the economic processes we imposed on them. That's what happened to those farmers. And it's absolutely saddening and incredibly miserable. It's been, for my sins, my fate to visit 850 of these houses. Let me tell you how incredible that situation is. Things have happened in Vidarbha, the epicenter of the suicides. I don't believe those have happened anywhere else in the planet, not even in the rest of India. Normally, a person committing suicide and who writes a suicide note to his or her loved ones. You write a suicide note to your wife and children. You write a suicide note to your aged parents. You write a suicide note to your friends and neighbors. In Vidarbha, in Western India, suicide after suicide note is addressed to the Finance Minister of India, to the Prime Minister of India, to the President of India, to the Chief Justice of India. And what? Have you ever heard of that happening? Addressing their letters to the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister. What do these letters say? I have a collection of them. They say, Mr. Finance Minister, you made all these announcements about increased rural credit, that we would get more credit, more loans, better terms of loans to be able to conduct our agriculture. In practice, we find that the banks are not giving us any loans at all. And there's a reason for that, because what was called agricultural credit was shifted out from the small holders to the corporate holders, to corporate farmers. How do I know that? Because we have Reserve Bank of India data on where the money was disbursed. Can you believe that 53% of Maharashtra, a state of 115 million, 53% of Maharashtra's agricultural credit was disbursed in Mumbai and Pune, two of the richest cities in the country of India, and disbursed through urban metro branches. Let me put it this way. It would be the equivalent of the bulk of California's agricultural credit being disbursed from bank branches in Beverly Hills. That's the equivalent. So you know where the money was going. So the suicide notes address these issues. The most poignant one I saw last was one by a man called Ramachandra Ratan Raut. I think you don't have an equivalent of judicial stamped paper, but you have a process called notarization in the United States, right? To make a document official. In India, that notarization process is called, you have a notarization. It has to be done on paper, non-judicial stamped paper with a revenue stamp of the government of India, which might cost 20 rupees or 50 rupees or 100 rupees, depending on the size of the transaction. A small person in India runs around most of his life trying to get documents authenticated in this fashion. I entered the house of Ramchandra Ratan Raut to find, because only those documents enable you to be taken seriously. You're taken seriously when your documents are notarized and stamped and on judicial or non-judicial revenue paper with a 20 rupee or 100 rupee stamp. I found that Ramchandra Ratan Raut had written his 8-page or 6-page suicide note on notarized, judicial stamped, non-judicial stamped paper with a 100 rupee revenue stamp, because he wanted to be taken seriously. It was addressed to the Finance Minister, the Prime Minister, and the President, and the Chief Justice, where he explained, and he said, all I'm asking of you is, now, okay, I can't repay your loan. I'm dying. Spare my family, don't harass them. I've just given you 3 of 850 stories. We don't have time. But where most of these suicides are concentrated in 5 states. India has 29 states, 6 union territories. They're concentrated in 5 states. What's common in those 5 states? The worst state, please note that the highest number of suicides is in the richest state in the country, Maharashtra, where Mumbai, with its stock exchange, the financial capital of India, most of these suicides occur 1 hour's flight from Mumbai. How is it that farmers are killing themselves in such large numbers in the richest state in the country. Those $100 billionaires, over 60% of them have addresses in Mumbai. Over half of them have passports that were issued in Mumbai. How can this be? It's called inequality. Okay? We have successfully transferred a gigantic share of the nation's resources to the top 1% or 2%. Let me be clear that those economic policies that I'm criticizing, I have been a beneficiary of them because I belong to that class that benefited from them. It's the class for which they were made. It doesn't mean that I should connive at it or endorse them. Okay? So you have yet another situation where the transfer of resources, the imposition of user costs, the withdrawal of life supports, the privatization. The agricultural universities, for instance, used to serve poor farmers. One of my fondest memories of the 70s is when I went to the Punjab Agricultural University and was standing in the corridor outside the veterinary department. And, the universities were so close to the community. A huge Sardar, a peasant, a Sikh peasant, walked into that corridor and marched into the veterinary faculty with a huge bull in tow and told the faculty, startled faculty, he's ill, treat him. To their eternal credit, the veterinary faculty of that university immediately treated that bull. I was so deeply impressed at how close the university was to the community, that a person felt it was his property. A farmer felt, this is my property. It belongs to me, and came and demanded attention for his animal and got it. Today, no farmer goes within a mile of an agricultural university because it does nothing for him. In the 60s and 70s, they produced cheap varieties of seeds. Today, they do research for Monsanto, Delta Pine, you name it. That's for Cargill, for Bunge, for Archer Daniels. This is who they do work for. They don't work for the farmer or the community anymore. Hemmed in on all these sides, the pressures on the farmers become unbearable. It took years and years and years to put these issues on the agenda. It wasn't easy. Two things struck me while trying to do this. I haven't covered a fraction of what I'd hoped to cover. By the way, I left the hotel without my paper. But it's okay. It's a story as a journalist I've had to tell so many times. I've written more than 200 reports on the agrarian crisis. Let me put it this way for you. The agrarian crisis in 5 words is the drive towards corporate agriculture. Millions of people will lose their livelihoods as fewer and fewer farm holdings and technology will produce the grain. The 2011 census of India is unique in our history. Okay? The 2011 census of India is unique in our history. It shows us 2 things. We are losing full-time farmers at the rate of 2,000 per day. They're not all killing themselves, don't get worried. They are migrating out of agriculture. They're migrating to the towns and cities in search of jobs that are not there. And they are mostly, largest numbers of them, are falling into the ranks of the agrarian underclass. From being landed farmers, they're moving to being agricultural laborers. So, which means, like in my home state of Andhra Pradesh, the number of farmers declined in 10 years by 1.3 million, but the number of agricultural laborers went up by 3.4 million, according to the census. So something devastating is happening in the countryside, but to get the elite, to get you and me to take it seriously, reminded me of 2 things from my days at a university. When I stepped onto the Jawaharlal Nehru University campus in 1978, I was never trained as a journalist, I was trained as a historian. I did my master's from there. I have a doctor in front of my name somewhere, but I'm a quack. It's a conferred degree. by the University of Alberta. I did try very hard to get a doctorate at JNU, but they kept expelling me. One of the things that I read was Nero and the Burning of Rome by Tacitus, the historian of that period. Tacitus detested Nero. Tacitus detested Nero, but he was dispassionate enough as a historian not to let it affect his judgment. In fact, he absolves Nero of having started the fire that destroyed Rome. He says the emperor was really worried and undertook all sorts of measures to put out the fires, which failed, and undertook all sorts of measures that to distract the masses. I'll come back to that in 1 minute. I'm winding up now. But the capacity of the Indian elite also to distract themselves, abstract themselves, take themselves away from the masses is great. In 1876, Queen Victoria, just to give you an idea of the distance of how far all of us, the elite, can get from people. In 1876, Queen Victoria decided she was tired of calling herself queen, so she started calling herself empress. And she held a party, the greatest party ever seen on the face of earth. And she had something to celebrate. She had recently acquired a large piece of real estate. We call it India now. And she held this gigantic darbar in 1876, a year of deadly famine. There were 68,000 guests, mostly royalty. You can read about this party in Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocaust and in Rajni Pamdat and other sources, but there's almost nothing about it in the history textbooks, barring that one book. There's almost nothing about the party. You do find it in the newspapers of that period, which reported two processes completely as if they had no link. On the one hand, they were reporting how police clubbed peasants to death on the barricades outside Mysore and Madras cities, as hungry, starving peasants were trying to enter the cities because there was famine in the countryside. In the 1 week that Victoria's party lasted, 140,000 people died in the Madras presidency of famine. Okay? That was reported faithfully. But no connection was seen with the Darbar, the costliest party in the world. 68,000 guests, mostly royalty. They came along with their own cooks, their own entourage. They came along with their horsemen, and then the guys who looked after the horses, and then the guys who cooked for the guys who looked after the entourage. Okay? And all this party went on in the middle. And you find, so the deaths went on, the famine deaths went on in tens of thousands. The party went on, the costliest party that we know of. You'll find almost nothing about it in the history textbooks. It's there in contemporary accounts of British officials, the party's description. Otherwise, but in this juxtaposition of the famine and the party, you will find it's almost a secret in history. Call it Victoria's original secret. Okay? But back to Nero, and I invite you to ask questions after that. Nero, in his desperation to distract the masses, held the greatest party in the ancient Roman Empire. The creme de la creme of the ancient Roman world was there. His own teacher in philosophy was there. The greatest minds of ancient Rome were there. The philosophers, the conquerors, the generals, the senators, the poets, the thinkers, they were all there. And one of the things Nero did to provide, in the words of Tacitus, to provide nightly illumination, was to bring out a number of criminal prisoners and burn them at stake, in the prose of Tacitus, thereby to provide the nightly illumination. Now, you can be shocked at this. I'm not. I think Nero was a little eager when it came to cruelty. The human race left him far behind in the 20th century and ever since. Right? I mean, it's nothing compared to what we have done to, we like to think, we like to wish away this issue by saying Nero was nuts. Unlike all those sane, just Roman emperors who routinely fed thousands of human beings to animals. Right? So Nero was nuts, forget it. For me, it was never an issue about Nero's cruelty was not the issue. For me, the question was this. I'll leave you with this. Who were Nero's guests? Who were these creme de la creme of the intellectual world, the poets, the singers, the bards, the philosophers, the thinkers, the senators, the explorers, who went on with the party? What kind of mindset did it require to quaff another goblet of wine, to pop another fig in your mouth as another human being on stake went up in flames? 5 years, I always ask myself, who were Nero's guests? 5 years into covering the farm suicides and agrarian distress, 30 years later, I had my answer. I think you have your answer. Thank you. What a simple question. It would take us a decade to, okay. Okay, one is yes, social mobilization does have often a very positive impact in terms of addressing these issues. Like, for instance, in the battles over land acquisition by the state, widespread protests against the country forced the previous government, to introduce a land acquisition act that at least made the process a little more humane relatively. Second, some major battles were won in the courts, like the villagers of Kalahandi against Vedanta. They won in the Supreme Court, and their sacred lands cannot be touched. Those are indigenous people. However, that's only part of the story. The other part is that governments then change the legislation. The new government has it on its agenda already to amend that legislation to make the seizure of resources from poor people much easier. They have said that, too. But social mobilization, absolutely, it's a must. What is your alternative? The other alternative is what these farmers have been doing, which is killing themselves. So yes, I would much rather see greater social mobilization. Also, in Indian history, there is a large tradition of social mobilization and protest that has been very effective in various ways. The same farmers who are killing themselves in hundreds of thousands in the 60s and 70s mobilized and fought for land reform, for land redistribution, for the ending of feudal relations in agriculture, and they've won. So the question we need to ask is, and I'll come to, that will bring me to his question. The question we need to ask is, what happened between the 60s and 70s and the 90s and 2000s that farmers who mobilized, unionized, had land struggles, saw land reform, what made farmers move from mass movements in the 60s and 70s to mass suicides in the 90s and 2000s? And in that, one of the most important elements of the answer is the transformation of the role of the state. As I said, the state withdrawing from sectors that matter to poor people. In the 60s and 70s, the Indian state was far more representative in the sense that it acted as an umpire, as a mediator between contending classes. Maybe it gave 70% to the elite and 30% to the workers, but it did that. Today, that's no longer the issue. It sees itself as the state representing the corporate world. We're talking about a corporatized state. So that change. Now the answer to that is larger mobilization than ever before. Now the question of whether it's a political or an economic reform, I think it's a reform in every sense of the word that you need. There's no compartmentalization. Economics is very, very political. We follow all over the world. As I said, I call it mechanomics because it tastes the same everywhere. We follow everywhere across the world what, to my mind, seems to be a fundamentally flawed and rather stupid philosophy. Okay? David Attenborough put it beautifully. He said, if you believe in infinite growth in a very finite planet, in a planet of limited resources, limited water, limited everything, if you believe in infinite growth in a very finite planet, you are either insane or you're an economist. So that's I'm saying that the reforms that you can introduce have to be very political and of an economic nature. We are moving in the wrong direction on the political front and on the economic front. In politics, the last election in India, you know what it threw up? 82% of our members of parliament are multi-millionaires by their own declaration in the affidavit that accompanies your nomination form. 82% of members of parliament are not millionaires. They're what we call crorepathies, meaning that every one of them is worth more than 10 million. Do you know that in the previous parliament, 60 months earlier, it was 53%. From 53%, it went to 82%, and the assets of some of the returning MPs have increased by 700 to 1,000% to 500%. Which stock market in the world, which investment will give you that kind of return? Okay, so you need serious, because now big money is taking over Indian politics the way it did American quite some time ago. That process is newer to us. There was more of an electoral, a very poor guy could stand and defeat a very big person. It still can happen in India to some extent, but it's shrinking very, very rapidly. So you got on one hand the economics and the third. Third, your question. Why ideal solution? There are actually also practical solutions. They are based on idealism, but they are actually located in the Constitution of India. One of the things that makes the Constitution of India unique and very different from most constitutions. I mean, some things were in your Bill of Rights, they were not in the Constitution, but in the Constitution of India, most constitutions tell you what is the framework of the law, what you may do, what you may not do, the do's and don'ts, particularly the don'ts, right? The Indian Constitution has a chapter. What are your rights and what are your duties? All constitutions do that. But the Indian Constitution has one particular chapter. It says what should be, the vision of society. It's called the Directive Principles of State Policy. And the first paragraph says, the state shall endeavor to mitigate and minimize and eliminate inequalities, social, political, and economic. That's the first, one of the first things the Directive Principles of State Policy tell us. This is a constitution which each and every one of those rights tells you, every one of the directive, the state shall in particular endeavor to raise the level of health and nutrition of its citizens. The state shall in particular try to guarantee the right of work of its citizens. I think it's a fantastic thing to have in a constitution. By the way, it also exists somewhere else. In the UN Declaration of Human Rights, we all quote the clause, we are all focused on the clause on freedom of expression. There are 5 or 6 clauses of the UN Human Declaration, Declaration of Rights, which I call the invisible clauses, clauses 23 to 26. The right to work, the right to unionize, the right to decent work, the right to assembly. All these are also part of the UN Human Rights Declaration. In which human rights conference are they the core or even the periphery of the discussion? So there's plenty we can do. All we have to, my understanding is that most of the rights most of the principles of state policy we ought to convert into a Bill of Rights and enforce that forthwith. Then you have you have then the basis for real solutions, not the solution. Sorry, you had a question. So I thought someone.
Maybe like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know about the women. Most of your pictures are about women.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, are most of the suicides of men? And if most of the suicides are men, what has been women's response? Have there been changes in how authorities organized in these communities? Has there been any mobilization by women in response to this? Your pictures of women holding pictures of dead husbands reminded me of pictures from Latin America
Of the missing.
Yeah.
There are also pictures of men holding the pictures of their wives who have committed suicide in that lot. But one more question and then, there are, a very, very quick round. Okay, quickly. Yeah?
Okay, awesome. So in the context of crop failure being a driving force behind these suicides.
Indebtedness, not crop failure.
So it's not crop.
I'm saying you've had farmers killing themselves in the midst of a bumper crop, huge crop. The indebtedness is the shock. There are price shocks, volatility. Look, 65% of the world's trade in agricultural commodities is controlled by half a dozen companies. Yeah.
What roles is the foreign companies like what's on the plate?
Okay, that's the second question. One more, and yes.
I recently had the displeasure of arguing with some Modi supporters before the last election.
Yeah.
What struck me was that they had this really strong belief that Modi was their really only hope for a better outcome of life. So my question is, when Modi's economic program fails, as it inevitably will to improve life for the majority of Indians, do you think the Indian left will be ready or successful in finally extricating India from its neoliberal?
Okay. These are three huge questions. Let me start with your thing about the Modi supporters. I wish them luck. I mean, they can believe. Everyone has a right to their beliefs. The Indian media certainly supports that belief. The media in India today are working hard at giving psychophancy a bad name. The kind of stuff they write. In fact, I think the Indian media are making Modi's public relations firm very insecure about their contract and about their jobs. Because, a PR professional has to worry about his reputation and class and requires a degree of sophistication. The kind of tongue hanging out psychophancy that you see in the media don't require any qualifications of psychophancy, of sophistication. They are corporate owned. The largest section of the Indian media is corporatized. The largest owner of the Indian media is the third richest man in the world, Mr. Mukesh Ambani. All these top media barons are corporate barons who stand to gain incredibly from the huge privatizations that are on the anvil. So when coal blocks are auctioned tomorrow, media companies are already there. So their media has to. Oh yes, in the last 5 years, about between 5,000 and 8,000 journalists and camera persons have lost their jobs. Yeah? Or the undesirable are on their way out. The corporatization process is taking place very fast. So, see the thing, but to be fair, don't think that these are only Modi's policies. That's not true. The previous UPA government also followed broadly the same policies. It's the nature of the NDA and Modi and UPA that they put those policies now on steroids, okay, and are much more aggressive about asserting them. Also, the corporate world today is far more aggressive about asserting that this is our state. So you're going to find a great deal of resistance. You're going to find a huge deal of failure in what happens. But the top 1% and 2% will continue to benefit as never before, and that will be the story projected to you in the media. The left, I think, is in extremely poor shape. They've taken a very bad beating. I hope they can get back, but right now they're on their knees. The second question about, your question was about, we were discussing the issue of corporations controlling agriculture worldwide. There is a United Nations report by the rapporteur, special One of the interesting things that happened with the collapse of 2008, while sector after sector got wiped out, one sector of corporations did quite well. The food and agribusiness corporations, they did well. They're traders, they're not producers of food, they're traders of food. Rabindranath Tagore, the first Asian and probably the first non-European Nobel laureate, put it so beautifully. More than, way back 100 years ago in 1913, Tagore said, food production is a source of misery. Food production is a source of misery. Control of food is a source of untold wealth. I believe that the two greatest crops in the world are not rice and wheat. The two greatest crops in the world are hunger and thirst. And more revenue is made out of the exploitation of that than of any physical crop. Now, in answer to your question, the trade in agricultural commodities is overwhelmingly controlled by about 6 companies. In seed, 30% of the world's seed is controlled by 1 company. Beyond that, take coffee. 4 major companies, Sara Lee, Kraft, Nestle, Starbucks, control the setting of coffee prices in the world. Whether they're able to use they're able to use prices in India to break strikes of Brazilian coffee workers, okay? By increasing the production in India, Kenya, Tanzania, and these places. They're able to play the poor against the poor. So the control of these, none of these guys are coffee producers. Not one of them is a coffee producer. What you're doing really is, you're a trader, you've established a monopoly over that, and within these countries you've established a chain that ensures and perpetuates your monopoly. In 2008, please look at another of my favorite journals, Fortune. Apart from the Fortune 500 and the Fortune Top 100, Fortune also puts out a list of the fastest growing companies in the world. The 2009 list, the 2009 Fortune list of fastest growing companies in the world, food companies are in the top rank. Food and agribusiness companies. And lo and behold, whose name led all the rest? Archer Daniels Midland. Cargill a little behind. Now, when the rest of the world was going down the tube, these companies were 4th in revenue and 1st in rate of profit. So there is that level of control also. When all these problems came up, the United Nations appointed a special rapporteur, a commission, to look at the linkage between speculation in commodity trade and food prices, because for the first time post-World War II, European and American middle classes were worried about food prices, which had not happened since after World War II. His name is Olivier de Schutter. His report is up on the net and it's free to download. They found that 60% of the grain traded on the major commodity markets of the world is controlled by index funds and corporations, not by farmers. Okay? So that's the monopolies. I maintain again, the 2 greatest crops in the world are hunger and thirst. Water privatization is one of the biggest clauses in most IMF agreements. On your question on women and the suicides. The suicide counts are horribly constructed. There are thousands of women suicides, women farmer suicides. I didn't have the time to go into that today, which are not counted because they're eliminated by a very simple method. Women are considered, most women in India do not have property rights, not legally, but by tradition. Legally they have, but by tradition. So what we call the patta, the title deed to the land, the woman's name will not be there. When she commits suicide, the authorities will register it as a suicide. They will not say there was no suicide. But it's not a farmer's suicide. So the most wonderful place in India to be a woman farmer is Haryana. 0 women's farm, because they don't consider women farmers. So there are 0. But if you look at the number of women's suicides in Haryana, it's huge. In the state of Haryana, it's huge. So you conceal a large number of suicides of farmers by not allowing women their right to be recognized as farmers. Women do 67% of all work in agriculture in India, and that work has gone up. Even that work has gone up tremendously because, as I said, the census shows us the largest migrations in our history. As more and more men have migrated out of agriculture, either out of the profession or out of the town, out of the village itself, the burden on women, now traditionally occupied in paddy transplantation, in livestock care, especially small livestock. In addition to that, now they have to take up the full burden of crop agriculture as well. And it's killing people, and it's literally killing them. Okay, so that's one more problem. And so you have a significant number of women who have committed suicide. They're not in the same numbers as men, but they are far more than are recorded. They're recorded as about 10-12%. I don't believe that's correct at all. I believe in the count of 300,000, we must have left out 30 to 40,000 women farmer suicides very easily. The evidence of the eye will tell you that when you go around. And what also happens after a male suicide is spectacular. The descent of the family into hell is very rapid. The only difference, see, everybody who is distressed is not committing suicide. In fact, it's astonishing that given the scale and pervasiveness of the distress, that only so many have done so. The neighbor to that farmer who's committed suicide is in equally bad shape. He's in equally bad shape, but hasn't committed suicide. But once one of them commits suicide, the family, losing its main breadwinner, descends very fast. That woman is now dealing with the bureaucracy, with the money lenders, with the banks, with the merchants, and looking after the kids, sending them to school, doing the cooking, the cleaning, the swabbing, and the farming. Imagine what her, very often, not very, I should say, I have seen in several households that 6 months to a year after the male farmer's suicide, the widow follows suit. Sometimes there have been three, rare, but three in one clan or household. Yeah, so the state of that. Now the reasons for this, and this is something you should know, so that you are more sensitive to this issue in your own societies than some of the leading academics and economists in the world are, who give all sorts of obnoxious reasons. Two great Columbia dons, for instance, have written a response to me in one of their books recently, where they've said that, you know, that the 300,000, that time it was 200,000, farmers is a very small number. We shouldn't get agitated over it. We should try bringing the rest of society's suicide rates to this level. Yeah? Yeah. Don Bhagwati and Sancho Panagaria have actually written that in their book. And then there are other frivolous, this is obnoxious. It actually mocks the death of 200,000 human beings. The other obnoxious reason is, oh, they're all drunkards, that's why they kill themselves. And this has come from journalists. It's come from one of the leading journalists in the region of Vidarbha, who stood up and challenged me in a public meeting. He said, yeah, I agree, all these suicides have taken place. And this was at a meeting of Union of Journalists. He said, isn't it a fact that all these farmers are killing themselves because they're drunkards? The problem with that argument is that if excessive consumption of alcohol is driving suicides, damn it, there'd be no journalists left in the world. and very few academics. And no human rights activists at all. Thank you.